The year is 1525. As the fires of Reformation, rebellion, and repression burn across Europe, one of the many Christian splinter groups that emerged during this period develops a unique definition of the godly life and the communion of saints. Over the next 5 centuries, this group will traverse the globe, migrating from Austria and southern Germany to Russia, and eventually to the American Midwest and southwestern Canada. Rejecting the institutions of privately owned wealth, individualism, and consumerism, its communities stand as enclaves within a materialistic, pleasure-seeking culture, an invisible alternative to an unquestioned lifestyle. The breakaway Christians who would become the Hutterites began as one group within the Anabaptist movement of the 16th century. Grouped by their opponents under a name that literally means the rebaptizers, the Anabaptists' rejection of religious authorities placed them at odds with the Vatican, while their insistence on holy living as a prerequisite for salvation made them unwelcome in the Protestant mainstream. This group of Reformation outcasts avoided the bloodbaths that followed armed revolts by many of their contemporaries. But to the civil authorities, Catholic and Protestant, this group's pacifist beliefs were just as dangerous as Europe faced internal conflicts and Turkish invasion. On the run from persecution and war, these tiny communities migrated across Eastern Europe for decades, seeking separation from a world they increasingly regarded as irretrievably sinful, and occasionally finding protection under local nobles willing to exempt productive farmers and craftsmen from military duties. It was during this period that this fractious, feuding group of loosely connected communities produced the leader whose name and ideas would define them for centuries. Jakob Hutter, though formally an elder for only 2 years before his execution in 1536, imbued his followers with a belief in the necessity for communal living and collective ownership of goods. They must resolve to leave the past behind, to face repression with complete fearlessness, and above all, to not be seduced by visions of building heaven on earth. Only God could confer such a reward. Man could only try to deserve it through disciplined living. After Hutter, the Hutterites were a distinct, unified movement. From 1565 to 1592, they experienced a period of cultural and economic growth in Moravia that became known as the Golden Period. But in the 17th century, renewed war and demands by once friendly nobles that Hutterites fight in the army sent them fleeing east again. During these decades, the habits of communal living broke down, and even after the Hutterites were invited to settle in southern Russia in 1770, with a promise of exemption from military service, individualism and economic self-interest had found their way into the Hutterite way of life. Some Hutterites re-established communal living, but in many areas, easy access to personal enrichment in the local economy proved more powerful than the ideals of Hutterite leaders. Only about 120 Hutterites were left to settle in Russia. A century later, they numbered nearly 1,300. Then in 1871, hard-pressed for soldiers, the Russian government revoked the Hutterite exemption from military duty, and the Hutterites sent representatives to other countries to investigate possibilities for resettlement. A young preacher, Paul Shetter, toured Minnesota and the Dakota Territory in 1873 and reported favorably about the sparsely populated farmland he found. An initial group of about 400 settled in South Dakota in 1874. Within 3 years, founding North American colonies were established by each of the 3 main groups of Hutterite communities. By immigration and expansion, the Hutterite colonies began spreading across the Midwest, generally self-sufficient and isolated from their neighbors in remote areas. The Hutterites' peaceful existence ended with World War I. With their pacifist beliefs branded as treason, Hutterites saw their German books destroyed, their property seized to pay for war bonds, and their young men brutally mistreated in military prisons for refusing to trade their plowshares for swords. The deaths of 2 Hutterite draftees in military custody, along with state laws in South Dakota depriving Hutterite communities of legal existence and confiscating their property, were the last straw. Hutterites fled, en masse, to new colonies in Canada. They would return to South Dakota gradually over the 20 years after the war, but only after the state, desperate for enough farmers to fuel its economy, offered them generous incentives to resume their former occupations. As a result of national soul-searching after the war, partly inspired by the treatment of groups like the Hutterites, conscientious objectors in future American wars would be given the option of working on civilian government projects instead of military service. Over the next century, the Hutterite population grew rapidly, today numbering more than 40,000. To ensure enough work for each member, Hutterites limit a colony's size. Currently, there are 484 Hutterite colonies in North America, as well as 1 in Japan and a small remnant of their culture in Russia. For the most part, Hutterites hold the same beliefs as other Christians. They read the same Bible with the apocryphal books and accept the major creeds. So what are the beliefs that make this community unique? To begin with, Hutterites believe that neither faith nor the rituals of a church are sufficient for salvation. The Christian must live a moral life to stand right with God, and this is possible only within a community that encourages the Christian on his journey while also separating the righteous from the temptations of worldly evil. As a means for a few to survive extreme peril, a Hutterite colony is often compared to Noah's Ark. Outside the restraint of the community's rules, tempted by the carnal world, man will inevitably give in to his sinful desires. Thus, the individual may not possess anything that is not subject to the community's rules. Not private property or money. Not space from which he can exclude others. Not unstructured time in which to do what he wishes. Not even his own interpretation of Scripture, if it contradicts Hutterite teaching unchanged across the centuries. Necessary goods such as clothing typically are distributed to each family at a designated time each year, although colonies differ in such administrative practices. This truly communal sharing of all things separates Hutterites even from other Anabaptist traditions, such as the Amish or the Mennonites. Like those communities, however, the Hutterites reserve baptism for adults. Years of preparation and an examination before the community precede the momentous decision. No Hutterite is ever required to be baptized, but only the baptized can marry or hold an office of leadership. Life in a Hutterite community is centered around work, both to maintain the colony's independence from the world and to ensure that each member avoids the temptations of idleness. To a Hutterite, honest work will always involve labor. To buy goods and resell them at a profit with no labor of one's own is sinful. A new colony will be founded whenever an existing colony has too many members to keep everyone occupied with work. The workday can begin as early as 3:30 in the morning and end as late as 10 at night. Women perform household tasks such as laundry, cleaning, or preparing the colony's communal meals. Men typically work in agriculture or agriculture-related specialties such as repairing machinery. To ensure that everyone's time is occupied, men who work in agriculture during the summer often spend the winter learning a different trade. Tasks are assigned by community leaders, taking into account each member's abilities. Although there is plenty of work to fill the day, ample time is allowed for breaks and meals. Men who complete their work early often will assist those who have not, so that the community's work as a whole is completed. With time rigidly structured and minutely divided into tasks, workdays pass quickly. Meals are eaten by the entire colony together, with children and young teenagers seated in a separate dining area from adults. Although everyone's work is valuable, certain occupations hold higher status in the community. Special respect is afforded to the preacher, the leader of the colony, his assistants, and the teacher responsible for instructing Hutterite children in German, the language of their religious life. Each colony is governed by a council of these men, plus a small number of other community elders. In addition to the German teacher for religious subjects, another teacher, a carefully selected outsider with a state teaching license, is hired to teach children in English such secular subjects as mathematics, reading, and science. Although minor juvenile disobedience often is conveniently overlooked, children and teenagers are not exempt from the requirement that they contribute to the colony. At home, in German school, and throughout the colony, children are socialized into an intricate system of rules and expectations, by which what is good for the individual is melted into what is good for the colony. A typical Hutterite family today will have from 3 to 5 children. Families of 10 or more children that were typical a few decades ago are no longer common, but a Hutterite woman still usually has more children than her counterpart in the general population. The main community building is usually located at the center of a Hutterite colony, flanked by longhouses of apartments. But these living spaces are not an individual or a family's private space to withdraw from the colony. They, too, belong to the community, and members enter one another's homes at will. On Sundays, the work schedule is lessened to observe a day of rest, though how much rest varies from one colony to another. Worship services are held in the morning and late afternoon. Although Hutterites do not construct churches in the usual sense, they do create space in a common building for Sunday worship and daily gatherings for prayer. Hutterites take communion once a year, on the Monday after Easter. Like other church-going Christians, Hutterites sit patiently through a sermon. But the words are not written by their preacher. As part of his training, each Hutterite preacher copies, by hand, a set of several hundred sermons composed centuries ago in the early years of the Hutterite tradition. Preaching consists mainly of selecting an appropriate sermon and inspiring the colony with a properly stylized delivery. Like Hutterite Bibles, songbooks, and religious teaching of children, sermons are still delivered in the same German in which they were written. Despite the emphasis on life within the community, Hutterites are permitted to have contact with the outside world. Borrowing books from the local public library often is a favorite form of recreation. Trips from a colony to a nearby town often involve visiting with non-Hutterite friends, and some of those friends might find themselves invited to visit the colony to celebrate a special occasion. Many Hutterite colonies actively participate in their local economies. Some Hutterites are even allowed to run their own side businesses providing services for their neighbors, though never, at least in principle, at the expense of their work in their own community. Buying luxuries and other aspects of consumerism are forbidden, but the occasional personal indulgence might be overlooked, a judicious flexibility that helps in the end to preserve the community's standards. Although Hutterite communities do not permit their members to run for office in the secular government, other forms of civic involvement are permitted, such as voting or serving in a volunteer fire department. Hutterites today do not object to any taxes except those specifically designated for war. In the United States, Hutterite colonies pay taxes as corporations. Since individual Hutterites have no property of their own, they pay no individual income tax. With their needs provided for by the community, they also do not receive welfare or Social Security benefits. Hutterites lose fewer than 2% of their members to apostasy, a rate that has risen in recent years but remains extremely low compared to that of other religious groups. Although a significant number of young Hutterite men leave their colonies to try the world, they usually return and resume their places in their colonies. Modern technology will not necessarily be rejected. Indeed, Hutterites depend on up-to-date equipment such as GPS devices for agriculture to maintain their way of life. Technologies that only provide for personal convenience, however, have no place in community life. Thus, Hutterites typically do not own passenger cars, radios, or televisions. With the increasing demand for education in a modern economy, some Hutterites are reassessing their tradition's long-standing lack of concern for education beyond 8th grade. In recent years, education through the equivalent of a high school diploma has become more common, although most Hutterites still see little value in the individualism and skepticism promoted by university-level education. In many ways, it is such adaptation that has enabled the Hutterites to survive across the centuries. While uncompromising in their beliefs, the Hutterites are flexible about the details. To be Hutterite is to know with remarkable clarity what is and is not important. Innovations that do not threaten core traditions can be adopted. Minor acts of individual rebellion that do not seriously undermine the community can be conveniently overlooked. And youthful mischief-making can be pardoned for the sake of showing youth their lifetime home, their own Noah's Ark that will keep them from the truly dangerous sins. The success of the Hutterite way of life can also be seen in what their communities do not have. Economic competition is not a part of Hutterite life. Their communities have no extremes of wealth or poverty. There are no jails in Hutterite colonies. Offenders against the community's rules may be removed from fellowship with anyone except the preacher, but a Hutterite is never banished. Upon a profession of repentance that the community judges sincere, the wrongdoing member is restored and embraced. Divorce and suicide are almost unknown in Hutterite life, and not a single homicide has been committed among the Hutterites in more than 400 years of their existence. In a world of estranged individuals, material acquisition, and spiritual despair, there stands the model, the proof, the offer of an alternative.